You have to understand, mate, that Vietnam was two very different wars depending on which flag was stitched onto your shoulder. If you were a Yank, especially a Yank in the rear echelon, the war was a logistical miracle. I remember the first time our patrol rolled into the massive US base at Long Bin. It was like driving into a different planet. They had paved roads. They had air-conditioned demountables. They had PX stores the size of supermarkets, selling everything from stereo systems to Playboy magazines. I saw a kid, a logistics clerk who'd probably never held a rifle in anger, eating a T-bone steak and washing it down with a Budweiser that was actually cold. Ice cold. In the middle of a tropical war zone, these blokes had ice cream machines. It was like Disneyland with guns. Then there was us. The Australian task force at Nui Dat. We were the poor cousins of the coalition, the Povo relations. While the Yanks were flying around in fleets of Hueys and Cobras, clogging the sky like a plague of angry locusts, we were lucky if we could beg a ride on a beat-up RAAF Iroquois. Our vehicles were Land Rovers that looked like they'd survived the Blitz in London, rattling tin cans that broke your spine every time you hit a pothole. Our uniforms were rotting off our backs, and our boots were constantly turning to mush in the wet season. The disparity was comical. I remember watching a US unit cleaning out a supply bunker. They were tossing out perfectly good boots, ponchos, and ammo crates just because they couldn't be bothered to inventory them. They treated equipment like it was disposable. If a Yank broke his M16, he went to the quartermaster and got a new one in plastic wrap. If we broke an SLR, we had to fill out 3 forms in triplicate, explain to the major why we were clumsy idiots, and then wait 6 weeks for a spare spring to arrive from Sydney. We were the elite unit of the Australian Army, the SASR. We were supposed to be the tip of the spear. We were out in the weeds doing the hardest reconnaissance work in the province, living on hard tack biscuits and lukewarm tea, moving like ghosts through the bamboo. And then we'd come back to base and see a US National Guard unit living better than the Governor-General of Australia. It gnawed at you. It wasn't just jealousy, though. God, I would have killed a man for a cold beer. It was practicality. We looked at their overflowing dumpsters and their unguarded motor pools, and we looked at our own rusting kit, and a collective decision was made. It wasn't an order written down on paper. It was a cultural shift. We realized that Her Majesty the Queen, bless her heart, was on a tight budget. She wasn't going to send us the gear we needed to fight comfortably. But Uncle Sam? Uncle Sam was rich, careless, and distracted. We didn't call it stealing. Stealing is what you do to your mates. Taking from the enemy is looting. But taking from the Yanks? That was just tactical reallocation. It was scrounging. We figured the American taxpayer wouldn't miss a few generators or a crate of steaks, but for a 5-man SAS patrol, that gear could mean the difference between a miserable existence and living like kings. So, we decided to go shopping. Now, before you go thinking we were just a bunch of common criminals with sticky fingers, you have to understand the code. There was a strict set of ethics to scrounging. It was a gentleman's game, really. Rule number 1. You never, ever nicked gear from the combat troops. If we saw a US Marine grunt or an airborne trooper slogging through the mud, we wouldn't touch his kit. That poor bastard was suffering just as much as we were. Stealing his ammo or his dry socks would be a sin, but the rear echelon motherfuckers, the REMFs, as we politely called them, sitting in air-conditioned offices at Long Bin or Vung Tau, they were fair game. In fact, we considered it a moral obligation to relieve them of their excess inventory. It was character building for them. The art of scrounging wasn't about sneaking around in the dark with wire cutters, dressed like a ninja. That's amateur hour. True scrounging is about audacity. It's about walking through the front gate in broad daylight, waving at the MP, and looking like you own the place. We quickly realized that the American military machine runs on 2 things, gasoline and bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy was their weakness. The average American supply clerk was terrified of paperwork and terrified of officers. We used both against them. The most dangerous weapon in our arsenal wasn't the SLR rifle, it was the clipboard. I'm telling you, mate, if you walk briskly into a US supply depot wearing a slouch hat, holding a clipboard, and looking visibly annoyed, you can walk out with anything. You just march up to the desk sergeant, some kid from Iowa who's just trying to count blankets, and you start shouting about requisition form 1-2 Alpha Bravo and how the general is going to have his ass if the tactical cooling unit, that's a fridge, isn't loaded onto my truck in 5 minutes. The beauty of it was the confusion. The Yanks didn't understand our rank structure. Our chevrons and pips looked weird to them. A confident Australian corporal could easily convince a confused American private that he was a British major or a special liaison officer. "Don't you know who I am, son? I'm the regimental quartermaster for the Queen's own bushrangers. Now sign this chit or ill have you on peeling potatoes until Nixon is out of office." The poor kid would panic. He'd look at the clipboard, which was usually just a racing form from a Sydney newspaper or a blank piece of paper with "You are gent" written on it in red crayon, and he'd sign it. He just wanted the angry Australian man to go away. We'd have guys forging signatures of non-existent American generals. We invented entire units. "Yes, son, we need these 20 cases of sea rations for the 1st Amphibious Kangaroo Battalion. Top secret stuff." Hush, hush. They bought it every time. It was a performance art. You had to have the swagger. You had to act like you were doing them a favor by taking their stuff. We weren't stealing. We were clearing their backlog. We were assisting with inventory reduction. And once we drove that truck out the gate, loaded down with fresh fruit, generators, and whatever else wasn't bolted to the floor, we weren't just soldiers anymore. We were the Robin Hoods of Phuoc Tuy province. If Nui Dat was the bush, then Long Bin and the Vung Tau Air Base were the big smoke. To a dirty digger fresh out of the scrub, these places were mythical. They were the El Dorado of logistics. You have to picture it. Acres and acres of asphalt baking in the sun, covered with rows of brand new jeeps, trucks, forklifts, and pallets stacked so high they blocked out the sun. It was Aladdin's cave, if Aladdin was a quartermaster sergeant with an unlimited budget. Our favourite hunting ground was the Vung Tau Air Base. It was a chaotic hive of activity, with C-130 Hercules transport planes landing every few minutes, vomiting out cargo from the States. The sheer volume of stuff was nauseating. I once saw a pallet of plywood perfect, marine-grade plywood sitting in the rain, rotting. Back at our base, we were sleeping in holes in the mud because we couldn't get timber to build floorboards. Seeing that waste didn't just make us hungry, it made us righteous. Getting inside wasn't a military operation, it was a theatrical performance. We called it the Trojan horse maneuver, but instead of a giant wooden horse, we used a battered, mud-caked Land Rover. We'd pick the scruffiest-looking vehicle in the motor pool, something with a missing door and an engine that sounded like a bag of spanners. We'd pile in, 4 or 5 of us, wearing our dustiest greens, slouch hats cocked at a rakish angle. The goal was to look harmless, slightly incompetent, and unmistakably Australian. We'd roll up to the main gate at Vung Tau. The American military police, MPs, guarding the perimeter were usually 9-year-old kids who were bored out of their minds. They were looking for Viet Cong sappers or NVA spies, not a bunch of grinning Aussies in a rust bucket. "G'day, Skipper," the driver would shout, flashing a smile that could charm a snake. "Just heading in to pick up some, diplomatic mail for the Brigadier, VIP stuff." Now, strictly speaking, we didn't have the right passes. Our paperwork was usually a gum wrapper or a dirty napkin. But we had something better than security clearance. We had the Universal Key. The Universal Key was a crate of Australian beer. You see, the Yanks had Budweiser, which tastes like canoe water. We had the good stuff, heavy, strong lager from back home. We'd keep a couple of cans on the dashboard, sweating in the heat. The MP's eyes would lock onto those cans like a laser. "Say, is that Aussie beer?" the MP would ask. "Sure is, mate," we'd reply, tossing him a can. "Keep it cold for later. You boys are doing a great job keeping us safe." Bribery? Maybe. Diplomacy? Definitely. The gate arm would lift, and we'd roll into the belly of the beast. Once we were inside the wire, we were invisible. The Americans were so overwhelmed with their own traffic that nobody paid attention to the little Land Rover weaving through the supply depots. We were just background noise. We'd cruise past the graveyards, massive lots filled with vehicles that had minor mechanical issues. A Jeep with a flat tire? Junked. A truck with a broken headlight? Abandoned. To the Americans, it was trash. To us, it was a spare parts superstore. We'd drive around, making mental shopping lists. Right, Bluey needs a new carburetor, and the mess tent needs a new fan. Oh, and look at that, a pallet of frozen turkeys. Grab the bolt cutters. We were like kids in a candy store, except the candy weighed 2 tons and required a forklift to steal. The crown jewel of any scrounging career wasn't a case of beer or a box of steaks, it was a vehicle. In the Australian Army, a Jeep was a rare commodity. You had to be a colonel to get your own wheels. In the US Army, even the chaplain's assistant seemed to have a brand new Ford M151 Mutt. It started, as most great ideas do, with a complaint. Our patrol commander was sick of walking 3 miles to the briefing tent in the monsoon rain. He looked at us one night over a tin of bully beef and said, "Boys, my boots are rotting, get me some wheels." We scouted the target, a motor pool near the long bin perimeter. It was a holding area for reserve vehicles, rows upon rows of brand new Jeeps, fresh off the boat, smelling of factory paint and rubber. They were sitting there, unloved and unused, while we were slogging through the mud like peasants. It was a crime against efficiency. The operation was planned with the precision of a deep reconnaissance mission. We went in at dusk, right around chow time, when the American guards were distracted by the promise of hot burgers. We didn't sneak in. We walked in carrying toolboxes, looking like a maintenance crew. We found her in the 3rd row, a pristine M151, barely a mile on the odometer. She was beautiful. The keys weren't in the ignition, but for an SAS trooper trained in demolition and sabotage, hot wiring a Ford was child's play. It took about 30 seconds to bypass the ignition switch. The engine purred to life, a sweet American sound. But driving a stolen US Army Jeep out the front gate was suicide. The MPs checked logbooks for vehicles leaving the base. We needed a disguise. We drove the Jeep to a secluded corner of the depot, behind a stack of shipping containers. Then, the transformation began. We had brought cans of spray paint, not olive drab, but a mixture of black and brown we used for camouflage. In 10 minutes, that pristine US Army vehicle looked like it had measles. We covered the white US Army stars with mud and duct tape, but the masterstroke was the modifications. We took a sledgehammer to the front fender, just a little dent to give it character. We ripped off the canvas roof. We hung a pair of muddy Australian boots from the roll bar. Essentially, we ugly-ed it up. We made it look like it had been in the bush for 6 months. Then came the license plate. We didn't have a real one, so we bolted on a piece of wood with random numbers painted in white, AUSTFORCE007. It was ridiculous. It was brazen. We rolled up to the exit gate. The MP stepped out, flashlight beam sweeping over the vehicle. He saw the mud, the dented fender, the weird paint job, and the 4 Australians grinning like idiots, smoking cigarettes. "What unit is this vehicle with?" the MP asked, frowning at the wooden license plate. "Royal Australian Bush Mechanics." "Mate," I said, handing him a warm beer. "Just taking her for a test drive to knock the carbon out of the engine. She's a bit rough, eh?" The MP looked at the battered Jeep. No American officer would be caught dead in a vehicle that looked that trashy. It didn't look like US property anymore. It looked like junk. "All right, move it along," he sighed, waving us through. "Get that piece of crap out of my lane." We drove out slowly, saluting him. As soon as we were around the bend and out of sight, we floored it. We laughed all the way back to Nui Dat. That Jeep served with our squadron for 2 years. We called her the Diplomat. She never appeared on any official register. She never had a service history, but she was the most reliable vehicle we ever owned. Of course, we didn't always steal. We weren't pirates, well, not all the time. Sometimes, we preferred to conduct legitimate business. We quickly discovered that the Vietnam War had its own unique economy, and the exchange rate was wildly in our favor. The American troops, especially the rear echelon guys who never saw combat, were obsessed with war trophies. They were desperate for something cool to send back to their sweethearts in Nebraska or Ohio, something that proved they were hard-bitten jungle warriors, even if their toughest daily battle was fighting the line at the mess hall. We, the SAS, had access to the things they wanted: enemy weapons, NVA flags, and the mystique of the bush. But the most valuable currency we possessed was sitting right on our heads: the slouch hat. That khaki felt hat with the puggaree band and the rising sun badge was like gold dust. To a Yank, it was the symbol of the rugged, crocodile-wrestling Australian. I'm not joking when I say a pristine slouch hat could buy you a used car in Vung Tau. We'd have American colonels offering us crates of whiskey, brand new radios, or even flight time on a helicopter just to get their hands on one. We used to trade our old, sweat-stained hats for brand new M16s or cases of C4 explosive. Then we'd just write home to Mum and say, "Lost me hat in a firefight. Love. Send another," and the army would issue a replacement. It was a renewable resource. But the real money was in the captured enemy equipment. The Yanks would pay a fortune for a Viet Cong flag. The problem was, genuine VC flags were rare. You didn't exactly find them lying around on every bush. So, being the enterprising soldiers we were, we decided to stimulate the market. We found a local tailor in Vung Tau, a lovely old Vietnamese lady who could stitch together a red flag with a yellow star in about 20 minutes. We'd buy them in bulk, 20 at a time. They looked brand new, which was a problem. A souvenir needs provenance. It needs to look like it survived the Tet Offensive. So, we'd take these brand new flags back to our tents and put them through combat conditioning. We'd rub them in the red dust. We'd stomp on them. We'd spill coffee on them. For the pièce de résistance, we'd take them down to the firing range and put a single 9mm bullet hole through the star. Voila. Instant battlefield authenticity. I remember one trade vividly. We drove a truckload of these authentic flags to a US logistics depot near Bien Hoa. We met a US supply sergeant who was practically drooling over them. "This is the real deal?" he asked, fingering the bullet hole. "Mate," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I pulled that off a jagged bamboo pole in the long high hills yesterday. Nearly took a round doing it." He nodded solemnly. In exchange for 5 captured flags, total cost to us, about $2, he unlocked a refrigerated shipping container. He forklifted out 10 boxes of grade A filet mignon steaks, intended for the US officers' mess. That night, back at Nui Dat, while the rest of the Australian task force was eating tinned ham and hard biscuits, our patrol sat around a fire, grilling steaks that were thicker than a phone book. We drank traded Budweiser, wore our spare hats, and toasted to the great American supply chain. It was the best meal I ever had, flavored with the sweet taste of capitalism. In the hierarchy of human needs, somewhere above oxygen and below ammunition, sits cold beer. In the suffocating heat of Phuoc Tuy, where the humidity was so thick you could chew it, a warm beer was a tragedy. It was an insult to the Australian spirit. The standard issue army ration included beer, but we had no way to cool it. We were drinking hot lager that tasted like yeast soup. Meanwhile, 5 miles away, the Americans had ice machines, slushy dispensers, and walk-in freezers stocked with ice cream. We decided it was time to bring the Industrial Revolution to the SAS lines. We initiated Operation Ice Age. The target was a US engineering compound near the coast. We'd scoped it out and noticed 2 things: a massive, industrial-sized diesel generator sitting on a trailer and a shipping container converted into a walk-in refrigeration unit. It was beautiful. It hummed with the sound of pure, electrical power. We rolled in with our stolen but repainted truck. This time, we didn't use the maintenance crew ruse. We went with the medical emergency gambit. I jumped out of the truck, looking frantic, waving a clipboard covered in red stamps, which I had made using a carved potato and red ink. I ran up to the US supply sergeant. "Mate, we've got a critical situation at the field hospital," I shouted. "Our blood bank cooling unit has failed. We've got plasma spoiling in the heat. I need emergency power and cold storage now, or men are going to die." The poor sergeant's eyes went wide. The mention of blood and dying men bypassed his bureaucratic brain and went straight to his heart. "Take it," he yelled, pointing at the generator and the fridge unit. Do you need a forklift? Well manage, I yelled back. We hooked the massive generator to our truck and used their own forklift to load the fridge unit onto the flatbed. We drove out of there at breakneck speed, the sergeant actually saluting us as we left. I almost felt bad. Almost. Back at Nui Dat, we set it up in a secluded corner of the SAS hill, camouflaged under a thick canopy of rubber trees. When we fired up that generator, the hum was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. We wired up the fridge. Within 2 hours, the temperature inside dropped to freezing. We stacked it floor to ceiling with Victoria Bitter, VB, and MU Export. That night, the SAS lines were the only place in the entire Australian task force with ice-cold beer. The morale boost was instantaneous. We sat in lawn chairs, also stolen, sipping frosty cans, listening to the hum of the stolen generator, feeling like we'd won the war. But the party didn't last long without scrutiny. The problem with a 50 kVA industrial generator is that it's loud, and the Americans eventually realized their blood bank emergency was taking a long time to resolve. 3 days later, a US military police jeep rolled up to our perimeter. 2 MPs stepped out, looking furious. They'd tracked the serial number, or maybe just followed the noise. That's US Army property, the big MP barked, pointing at our beloved generator. You stole this from the 12th Engineers. Our Squadron Sergeant Major, SSM, stepped forward. He was a terrifying man with a moustache that could frighten small children. He didn't blink. Stole? The SSM rumbled. This is a tactical loan, authorized by General William Westmoreland himself. He produced a piece of paper. It was a masterpiece of forgery. It had the US Army letterhead stolen, the official seal, drawn by our cartographer, and a signature at the bottom that was an illegible scrawl under the typed name, General B. S. Cutter, U.S. Logistics Command. The MP squinted at the paper. He looked at the SSM, who was resting his hand on a 9mm pistol. He looked at the fridge, where a blast of cold air and the smell of beer was escaping. General Cutter? The MP asked, unsure. A very close friend of the Australian Prime Minister, the SSM lied smoothly. Now, unless you want to create an international diplomatic incident and explain to the General why you disconnected the, Tactical Morale Preservation Unit, I suggest you drive away. The MP looked at the paper again. He knew it was fake. We knew it was fake. But he also knew that arguing with the SAS in their own camp was a losing battle. He sighed, looked at the fridge longingly, and whispered, "Can we at least get a cold one?" We gave them a 6-pack each. They tore up the report and drove off. The generator stayed. As the war dragged on, the US military police, MPs, got wise to our antics. They stopped being the friendly, waving gatekeepers and started setting up dedicated anti-scrounging checkpoints on the main supply routes between Vung Tau and Nui Dat. They were looking for stolen jeeps, unauthorized generators, and crates of misappropriated filet mignon. It became a game of cat and mouse, and frankly, the mouse was having a hell of a time. We had to get creative. We couldn't just drive stolen goods under a tarp anymore. They were checking under tarps. We had to use camouflage level, Australian. One of our most genius moves involved the pig truck. We had access to a civilian truck used to transport livestock for the local villagers as part of our Hearts and Minds campaign. It stank. It smelled of manure, rotting vegetables, and wet animal fur. No American in his right mind wanted to go near it. We realized this smell was a tactical asset. When we liberated a disassembled heavy machine gun mount or a crate of high-end radio batteries, we wouldn't hide them in a clean box. We'd throw them in the back of the pig truck and cover them with a layer of straw and organic fertilizer. Real, fresh manure. We'd roll up to the MP checkpoint. The American MP, pristine in his starched uniform and white helmet, would step forward, nose twitching in disgust. "What are you hauling?" He'd ask, covering his face with a handkerchief. "Agricultural supplies for the orphanage, mate," I'd shout cheerfully. "Just pigs and fertilizer. Want to check?" I'd make a show of starting to unlatch the tailgate, letting a fresh wave of stench wash over him. No, just go," Get that thing out of here, Head yell, waving us through frantically. We'd drive off, the fertilizer concealing thousands of dollars of sensitive military electronics. But our masterpiece was the deconstructed bulldozer. The SAS needed a small earth mover to dig new latrines and defensive berms. The Americans had plenty, but they were too big to steal whole. You can't exactly hide a yellow bulldozer in your pocket, so we stole it in pieces. Over the course of 3 weeks, different patrols visited the same U.S. engineering depot. One group borrowed the hydraulic arms, another group liberated the engine block, a third group, claiming to be a scrap metal detail, drove off with the tracks. We smuggled the chassis out underneath a load of sandbags. The MPs at the gate saw trucks leaving with what looked like piles of junk metal. They never put the puzzle pieces together. They didn't realize that the scrap iron leaving on Tuesday fit perfectly with the engine parts that left on Thursday. Back at Nui Dat, our mechanics wizards with a wrench reassembled the beast in a hidden clearing. We painted it jungle green, slapped a kangaroo stencil on the side, and christened it the Matilda. One day, a U.S. engineering officer actually visited our base for a liaison meeting. He was standing right next to the Matilda, admiring its defensive earthworks. "Nice dozer," he commented. "Looks exactly like the D4 model we use. Didn't know you Aussies had those." "Oh yeah, mate," our sergeant replied without skipping a beat. "Standard issue Commonwealth earthmover. Built in Melbourne. Runs on Vegemite and grit." The American nodded, impressed by Australian engineering, completely unaware he was leaning against his own stolen property. It was the perfect crime. The evidence was too big to hide, so we just hid it in plain sight. Looking back now, 50 years later, I suppose you could say we were a bunch of thieving rascals. The brass back in Canberra would have had a heart attack if they knew the extent of our acquisitions. We were running a black market economy that rivaled the GDP of a small island nation. But here's the thing, mate. It wasn't about greed. We didn't steal to get rich. We didn't send that stuff home to sell. We stole because, in the middle of a war that made no sense, the only thing that mattered was making life a little bit bearable for the bloke standing next to you. When I handed a cold beer to a mate who had just spent 3 weeks lying in a swamp, shaking from malaria and fear, that wasn't theft. That was mercy. When we secured a generator so the lads could listen to music and drown out the sound of the mortars, that wasn't larceny. That was sanity. We were the larrikins, the mischievous rebels who didn't give a damn about the rules but would die for our mates. And truthfully, I think the Yanks loved us for it. Sure, the MPs chased us, and the supply officers shouted, but deep down, the Americans admired the hustle. They were cogs in a massive, impersonal machine. They saw us, these scruffy, sunburnt Australians driving stolen jeeps and wearing unauthorized hats, and they saw a kind of freedom they didn't have. We were the wild little brothers of the coalition. We were the guys who could walk into a bar fight, punch the biggest guy in the room, steal his wallet, and buy him a drink with it afterwards. I remember my last day in country. We were packing up to rotate home. We couldn't take the heavy stuff with us. We couldn't exactly check a stolen industrial generator onto a Qantas flight. So, we did the honourable thing. We gave it back. Sort of. We left the Diplomat, our trusty, stolen jeep, parked right in front of the US MP station at Vung Tau. We left the keys in the ignition and a note on the dashboard. It read, "Thanks for the loan." She pulls a bit to the left, and the brakes are dodgy, but she served the Queen well. Yours truly, the SAS. I like to think the MP who found it smiled. We left Vietnam with our bodies battered and our minds a bit scrambled, but we walked tall. We had fought the enemy on our own terms, and we had fought the logistics war on our own terms too. We proved that while the British might have taught us discipline, and the jungle taught us silence, it was the Americans who unwittingly taught us the value of free enterprise. So, here's a toast to the United States Army Supply Corps. You boys were the finest quartermasters the Australian SAS ever had. You kept us fed, you kept us driving, and most importantly, you kept our beer cold. We couldn't have done it without you. And if any of you are still looking for that missing bulldozer, check the bottom of the South China Sea. We might have had a little accident trying to load it on a boat. Sorry about that, mate. No hard feelings.